Interested in learning about wine, but not sure where to start? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. I'm your host, Haley Bowman, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm a wine enthusiast turned wine educator and founder of the Seattle-based wine tasting business, Cork and Fizz. It is my goal to build your confidence in wine by making it approachable and lots of fun. You can expect to learn everything from how to describe your favorite wine to what to pair with dinner tonight, and so much more. Whether you're a casual wine sipper or a total cork dork like myself, this podcast is for you. So grab yourself a glass and let's dive in. Welcome back to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. Today, we're going to be starting a new series. I wanted to have a chance to really deep dive into the different varietals, aka the grapes, that make wine. And I thought it'd be fun to start off with a wine grape that I think needs to be given another chance, and that is Chardonnay. I feel like people feel very strongly about Chardonnay and usually in the negative direction. So my goal by the end of this is to teach you a lot about it and hopefully encourage you to maybe try something new, try a new Chardonnay, give it another chance, and hopefully you'll have to let me know what you think. We're going to start by covering a little bit of the history, then we'll deep dive into the grape a little bit, what makes it special. We're going to cover warm versus cool climate and why that makes a difference in Chardonnay. Of course, we're also going to have to hit on why there was a rise and fall of Chardonnay in the US specifically. And of course, we're going to address the buttery flavor that I think many of us associate with Chardonnay. Let me tell you right now, it doesn't actually come from the grape, okay? So your anger and your frustration at Chardonnay should not be at Chardonnay, all right? It's not its fault. And then we'll finish with 6 popular regions that make Chardonnay. These are 6 of my favorite, and I'll let you know what kind of flavors you can expect from these regions. So let's get into it. Starting off with a little bit of history on Chardonnay. So the grape itself originated in a small village named Chardonnay, and this was located in France and specifically in the Mâconnais region, which is in the southern portion of Burgundy, France. And we'll talk about Burgundy when we get to some of our popular regions for Chardonnay. The name of the village meant place of thistles or thistle-covered place. Chardonnay is the child of Pinot Noir, another popular grape in Burgundy, along with Gouais Blanc. This is a white grape from the Roman times. It made lesser wines. It's nearly extinct now. So if you've never heard of it, that probably makes sense. You may never find it out there as a wine. Chardonnay was likely spread by monks throughout France, so that's how it became more popular and was grown in many areas. The earliest recorded reference to Chardonnay occurred back in 1330, and this was when Cistercian monks built stone walls around their Clos de Vigo vineyard, exclusively planted to Chardonnay grapes. Now, with most histories of wine and grape varietals, there often tends to be a competing history or something else that is believed. Many of these are very hard to prove because they're just based on written references and, what we have access to. So another stream of history points towards Chardonnay coming from Lebanon. And this isn't too crazy of a thing to think because have you ever heard the terms Old World and New World? So Old World refers to the region where modern winemaking began. And this is essentially Europe, right? And New World is then anywhere that vines were brought to from Europe. So basically the US, South America, anything like that. However, we're missing the very beginning of the story here. And so before there was an old world, there was the ancient world, and this includes the area of Lebanon. And so the ancient world is where winemaking truly began. We just say it's not the modern winemaking. There was a pretty big jump between when wine was being made in the ancient world and then when it was being made in the old world. So anyway, it's not crazy to think that Chardonnay could have come from Lebanon. However, there are no written references to Chardonnay originating in Lebanon until much later than 1330. So we're kind of going off that written reference. There was also an Austrian vine very similar to Chardonnay called Morillon. The name Morillon has been used during the Middle Ages in the region of Burgundy. Remember, again, that's where Chardonnay originated, and was actually an old name for Chardonnay in the region of Chablis, which is in Burgundy. And we'll talk about that later, too, in our regions. Now, going into a little more detail on the grape itself, on the grape of Chardonnay, people often talk about Chardonnay as a blank canvas. And by that, they mean it's very chameleon-like. It's very adaptable, and it can essentially soak up the influence of both the climate on where it's planted and the techniques of the winemaker. And this is very unique for grape varieties. Very few others do this. So the Chardonnay grapes themselves are relatively neutral. Remember when I was saying that buttery flavor does not come from the grape itself, it comes from the winemaking. So flavors and aromas that come to mind regarding Chardonnay are actually just a byproduct of the vinification process, aka winemaking. And this is why I believe it's nearly impossible to hate all Chardonnay. There are so many different styles made in different regions and wineries across the world that you're bound to find one that you will enjoy. Along with being versatile, the popularity of Chardonnay is also due to being fairly easy to grow. Chardonnay grapes grow on a hardy, adaptive plant that tolerates both heat and cold alike. The only challenge in the vineyard is that they ripen fairly early, which can cause a problem and make them vulnerable to the spring frost. If that grape ripens early and frost hits, you can lose a lot of the grapes. Now, while Chardonnay vines can grow in many different soils, their favorites are poor soil with high amounts of limestone, which, again, many of the regions we're going to talk about at the end have this exact soil type. So remember we talked about Chardonnay is a blank canvas, and this means the area that it's planted in and the winemaking techniques can have an effect on the wine that is essentially made from the grapes. So let's start by talking about the climate first. Now, keep in mind that climate is different than weather. Both of them affect the grapes and thus the resulting wine, but climate refers to the general condition in a given place over a long period of time, while the term weather refers to temporary conditions that might or might not be unusual. Weather more has an effect on the vintage, you caring about what year the wine was made, not necessarily like just the wine in general. That's where we're going to look to the climate. So we typically break down the climate. The easiest way, simplest way is cool climate versus warm climate. Now, Chardonnay can grow in both of these different climates, and it grows pretty well in both of them. However, the grape is going to develop differently, and then you're going to have a different wine. So in a cooler climate, you can expect less ripeness in the fruit, right? This makes sense. They have less warmth. The warmer areas, they get riper fruit. So in this case, we're going to have less ripeness because it's cooler. It's going to be more tart, bright fruit flavor. You're going to have higher acidity because there's less sugar in the grape. Now, where this comes from, super quick, I think I've hit on this in an earlier podcast, but the fermentation process is really important to know here. How do we get from grape to wine? Well, first you have sugar in the grapes, and then you add yeast to those. And the yeast eats all the sugar, and as it does this, it produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. So if you have a lot of sugar in your grape, it's ripened a lot, you've got a lot of sugar in there, there's more sugar for the yeast to eat, and thus it makes more alcohol. Now, if we're in a cooler climate, like we're talking about now, you're going to have less sugar. There's actually going to be more acidity in that grape instead. And so there's not as much sugar for the yeast to eat, and thus it produces a wine with less alcohol. And with less alcohol, you're generally going to have a lighter body. And remember from the first episode, body of the wine is the weight of the wine, how heavy it feels. So this is going to be nice and light from a cooler climate. So in summary, cooler climate. In the fruit, you're going to have less ripeness. It's going to be more of a bright tart flavor. There's going to be higher acidity. And because of that lower ripeness, there's going to be less sugar. Because there isn't as much sugar for the yeast to eat, you're going to have a lower alcohol level in the wine. And then because there's a lower alcohol level in the wine, you're going to have a lighter body. Now, on the flip side, in a warmer climate, our fruit is more ripe. We have a softer, sweeter fruit flavor. Now, our grape has less acidity and more sugar. And with more sugar, there's more, the yeast can produce more alcohol. So in a warmer climate, our wine is going to have higher alcohol, and with higher alcohol comes a fuller body, meaning that weight of the wine is heavier, it's more viscous. So these are just in general. Obviously, weather is going to play a part every year. It's going to be slightly different. Then each area of the world has a slightly different climate. So there's going to be a couple different things that play into that as well. But just keep that in mind. Now, before we get into our regions, we have to address the rise and fall of Chardonnay. So Chardonnay is the most planted white grape in the world. It can be found in over 41 countries. So whether you feel like Chardonnay has completely fallen, or maybe it's starting back up, it is still popular. It is still widely planted, right? It's because it's easy to grow and people do like drinking it. Now, going back a little bit in the history, so the original rise, right? This is when, back in the 1980s, Chardonnay was doing very well, especially in areas like California in the US. And something extremely important happened at this time. Chardonnay became a name more familiar to the world's wine buyers, so all across the world, than any of the geographically named wines. These would be ones like Chablis, Burgundy, essentially all of your European wines. And these were the top dogs at the time, right? Before in the 1980s, when you thought of, a good wine, you thought of a Burgundy and you thought of a Chablis, and that's what you asked for when you went to the wine shop, and that's what you knew what to buy. However, in California, they had decided to name their wines by the varietal rather than the region it was grown. So they were calling their Chardonnay wines Chardonnay. And people began buying them, they began enjoying them, and so they knew to go back to the store and find a Chardonnay. And so now people knew what to look for, and they weren't thinking about the geographically named wines, they were thinking about Chardonnay. However, this was also a time of decadence and excess. Wine drinking was in fashion in a way it never had been before. So instead of just having your small wineries making wine and selling them, a lot of the big businesses got into wine at this time, and they produced Chardonnay because people loved Chardonnay. So they began flooding the market with affordable bottles of Chardonnay. They also wanted to turn people who weren't interested in wine into wine drinkers. So they basically made a Chardonnay into a wine for people that didn't like wine. What does this mean? They made it sweeter. They left more sugar in it. They had it big and bold. They really wanted to produce this big style, so they were putting them in oak barrels or adding oak chips to the wine, and this is what causes that really rich mouthfeel. And then they were also making it buttery. And this, again, we'll talk about this in a second, but that didn't come from the oak. It came from a fermentation process that the wine goes through. But they really wanted to make these big, bold, sweet wines because people who didn't like wine tend to enjoy that style. Now, of course, with this became popular for a little while, but there was, of course, a backlash. What rises must fall. And in the 1990s and 2000s, this backlash, which was famously deemed ABC, aka anything but Chardonnay, you had many people turning their nose up at Chardonnay and giving up on it completely. Now, I'm hoping we're far enough past that we're willing to give Chardonnay another chance here and learn about the different styles that we can make. Okay, last thing before we get into 6 of my favorite regions for Chardonnay, we need to talk about that buttery flavor that people associate with Chardonnay. Now, you may think this buttery flavor comes from an oak barrel because we typically think of a Chardonnay as an oaked Chardonnay or an unoaked Chardonnay. And so many people associate that oaked Chardonnay with a buttery taste, when in actuality, there is something else at play there. So let's talk about the oak first. So oak is a porous material and it allows for oxygen to interact with the wine. So when you have a Chardonnay wine in contact with oak, what that oxygen contact will do, it'll produce this very broad mouthfeel. It adds texture and it makes it smoother. The oxygen contact invigorates the wine. It essentially stretches the palate of it. So instead of it being super sharp and acidic, you get this more smooth mouthfeel when you have your wine that's been in oak. Fun fact, most of our red wines are in contact with oak of some kind. So that is also what gives it, they give that nice kind of mouthfeel to it. Now, when we're talking about oak barrels, I have an idea of what you're picturing in your head. The thing is that there are lots of different aspects to oak that will change how it changes the wine. So what do I mean by that? When it comes to oak, you can use a new oak barrel. You can also use an old oak barrel. You can use a small oak barrel, like what you're picturing in your head, I think, right now. Or they have these giant oak barrels. You can also use oak barrels that have been toasted just a little bit. So the inside, they actually put it over a fire and they toast that barrel a little bit, or you toast it a lot. And all of those things are going to change how it impacts the wine. In general, the smaller the barrel is and the newer it is, the more of an effect it has on the wine. And in particular, those newer, smaller barrels will impart flavor on the wine. And these flavors include toast, spice, caramel, vanilla, coconut, but they don't include butter. The oak barrel is not giving it that buttery flavor. That buttery flavor instead comes from a compound called diacetyl, and this is a byproduct of something called malolactic fermentation. This might sound pretty fancy, but stick with me here. Malolactic fermentation is a secondary fermentation that wines can go through, where malic acid, akin to the acid that you would find in a green apple, this is naturally found in the grapes, so you have malic acid, is transformed into lactic acid, which is an acid you'd find in milk products. And then the diacetyl is a byproduct of that fermentation process. And that is what causes that buttery flavor and that buttery sensation. Now, of course, the buttery flavor combined with that smooth feeling that you get from the wine being in contact with oak is probably what gives you that big, bold, melted butter kind of feel. But that flavor in and of itself comes from malolactic fermentation, not the oak. Do you ever feel like you're stuck in a rut, doing the same old thing day in and day out? You wake up, go to work, come home, go to bed, and repeat. When life gets busy, it can be easy to fall into that routine and forget how important it is to prioritize joy and fun. But what if I told you there was a way to break out of that cycle? A way to bring more excitement and adventure into your life. And it involves one of the most wonderful things in the world, wine. Introducing my Cork Crew Virtual Tasting Club. This is not your ordinary wine club. This is a community of people who are passionate about exploring new flavors, learning about different wine styles, and having fun along the way. Each month, we'll select 2 styles of wine to focus on. We'll taste them together virtually, all while learning more about the regions that the wines are from and the grapes that make the wine. You'll also have the opportunity to meet winemakers, sommeliers, and other wine professionals through our monthly community events. But it's not just about the wine. It's about breaking out of your routine, trying new things, and having a little fun. Imagine being able to impress your friends at your next dinner party with your newfound wine knowledge. Feeling confident when you walk into a wine shop, knowing exactly what to look for and what you'll enjoy. Imagine adding a little bit of excitement to your everyday life. So why not do something for you? Come join the Cork Crew Virtual Tasting Club and start exploring the endless sea of discovery and joy that is the world of wine. Sign up at my website, corkandfizz.com/thecorkcrew, and don't forget to use code WINE101 to get your first month free. And now, back to the show. Okay, I wanted to finish this podcast by talking about some of my favorite regions for buying Chardonnay from. And each of these regions produces a wine slightly different. And honestly, none of them are quite your big, bold, buttery bombs, I guess you could say. Nothing wrong. If you love that style, you go for it. I've actually been turning more onto the oaky style. I like that smoothness and that richness. It's especially nice in the winter when it's cooler. However, I did want to introduce you to some more kind of brighter styles that you might not think of right away when you think of Chardonnay. And I'll admit, none of these are from California. I'm sorry, California. I love your Chardonnay, but I wanted to highlight a couple other regions. Okay. Starting off, we better start with the most revered Chardonnay of all, and that is one from Burgundy, France. This region is in eastern France, and it's the birthplace of Chardonnay. And honestly, I think it's where it absolutely shines. But be aware when you're shopping for Chardonnay from Burgundy, it is very likely it will not say Chardonnay on the label. Rather, any white wine from Burgundy that just says the region on the label. So if it just says Burgundy or Bourgogne Blanc, or I'm trying to think of what else it would say. But if it says on the back that it's produced in Burgundy, or if it has the words Burgundy, France on it, and it's a white wine, you can bet that it's going to be a Chardonnay. The only time it won't be is if it's called something else. Aligoté is one of the only other white grapes grown in Burgundy, and they have to label that wine using the word Aligoté. So if you don't see anything else written on a white wine from Burgundy, it's going to be a Chardonnay. Now, Burgundy itself can be broken down into a few smaller regions, but in general, you can expect a cooler climate here, lots of limestone-rich soil, and the flavors in the wine, you're going to get this crisp apple, some citrus. If you're in a little warmer region, you might get some peach and apricot, and then you get some toasted almonds, and just the slightest hint of oak and malolactic fermentation. So it's not going to be a lot, but I don't want you to avoid this just because it does have a little hint of oak. It's just enough to balance out the acidity. Now, like I said, Burgundy can be broken down into a few smaller regions, and I did want to highlight one in particular. So you can look for just a plain Burgundy, white Burgundy wine, or you can look for a Chablis, and this is Chablis, Chablis. This region is situated in northern Burgundy, and it's recognized for producing really lean, almost described as like steely or lightning Chardonnays. They have this very unique minerality to it. And remember, minerality is this sense of wet rock. So when you're walking by a waterfall or the pavement after it's just rained, that's what we think of when we think of minerality. So basically, if you like Sauvignon Blanc, have a feeling you're going to love a Chablis. This is also one of my go-to wines when I'm having oysters or seafood. It's got that really nice acidity to it. And honestly, you won't even notice that it's a Chardonnay. It's completely different than anything you'd ever imagine. All right, before we leave France, one other region we have to talk about, and that is Champagne. Champagne, the region, of course, for our famous sparkling wine. The white wine that grows in this region is Chardonnay. So if you want to try a sparkling Chardonnay from Champagne, look for what's called a Blanc de Blanc. And this stands for white of white, essentially a white wine made from white grapes. Champagne is located north of Burgundy, so we're moving further away from the equator, aka it's going to be an even cooler climate. In terms of flavors, we're going to get that green apple, that lemon, that peach, and then something unique because this is a sparkling wine. You're going to have this brioche. It's this yeasty, like, I want to say buttery, but not in like the way you're thinking. I don't want this to be like, oh, shoot, I shouldn't try this. But it's just this like buttered bread just came out of the oven. Really beautiful texture. And again, it's sparkling. So it's got this like bright acidity, but a really nice, smooth mouthfeel. If you can't tell, when I buy a champagne, my go-to is a Blanc de Blanc. I absolutely love it. Okay, I think it's time to head out of France and check out some new world areas for Chardonnay. Now, you'll hear in a later episode that my love for wine started in Oregon's Willamette Valley, and Chardonnay is one of the wonderful wines that this region produces. So in Willamette Valley, you can essentially imagine it's like a Burgundy replica in Oregon. It shares more in terms of latitude and climate. So if you're looking at a map and you take the latitude from Burgundy and you take it all the way west over to the US, over to Oregon, you're going to hit pretty close to where the Willamette Valley is. And this means that it has a very similar climate to Burgundy, France as well. This also means it's going to be very different from California at that more southern latitude and warmer climate. Really interesting, Willamette Valley's Chardonnay acreage has actually doubled since 2014. So they are really doubling down on this grape, and they know it can produce really, really lovely wines. It was one of my favorite wines. I will say, though, do not drink these wines at fridge temperature. Really shouldn't drink most white wines at fridge temperature. But I remember after I'd purchased a bottle down in Oregon, and I remember putting it in the fridge, bringing it home, putting it in the fridge, and then opening it up and pouring myself a glass. And I, went to sip the glass and I was like, this is nothing like what it tasted like when we were down in Oregon. So I let it sit there, and then I actually came back to it probably like half an hour later, and it was perfect. So honestly, most of these wines, other than maybe the Chablis and the Champagne, I'd recommend letting it sit outside of the fridge for at least 20 to 30 minutes. All right, back to Willamette Valley. In terms of flavor here, you're going to get that bright, vivid fruit that the New World, so anywhere besides Europe, is known for. There is going to be some oak contact, but it's often an older oak or larger barrel. So we're mainly going for that kind of smoothness without too much added flavor, though I do remember coconut being a very common flavor I would get personally when I was drinking Willamette Valley Chardonnay. You're also going to get that minerality again. Remember, that's like wet rocks, waterfall kind of flavor. Okay, next region I have unfortunately not visited, though I'd love to visit at some point, is the Yarra Valley in Australia. This region is located in Victoria, which is the southeastern tip of Australia, which is where you'll also find Melbourne. This is actually a cooler climate, again, because we're in the southern tip of Australia in the southern hemisphere, thus we're further away from the equator. So that cool climate's going to give it a nice crisp acidity. Not quite as sharp as a Chablis, that's probably our most acidic besides the Champagne. But the Chardonnay and Yarra Valley are going to be more acidic than your typical Burgundy and probably more acidic than our Willamette Valley as well. In terms of flavor, you're going to get more fresh citrus, a little more green apple versus like a yellow apple that you'll find in the Willamette Valley Chardonnay. There, again, will be some oak aging in these. You'll get a little vanilla in toast, but it's not going to overwhelm that bright fruit. Okay, last region, and this is where I think you can find your best budget bottles of Chardonnay, and that is the Aconcagua Valley in Chile. This area is going to be a bit warmer climate. It's probably the warmest of all the regions I've listed thus far, but they're also located right on the western edge of South America. And so they're getting that nice cool breeze. This cool sea breeze helps lock in some acidity in those grapes so they don't become overwhelming. Chile is famous for creating wines that are nice and smooth and elegant, but they all have this really nice earthy note and very striking and unique note to them. In terms of flavors, what you can expect from your Chilean Chardonnay, you will definitely get some more tropical fruit. So think like pineapple, melon, star fruit. And again, there's that minerality. We're going to get some ripe peach, some citrus, some white flowers. And then a really unique one that I found is meringue. So again, I think that comes from a little bit of malolactic fermentation, but not an overwhelming amount. Chile is still an up and growing region, or an up and coming region, I suppose I should say, but they're definitely getting smaller regions within the area more well known. So if you're looking for a Chardonnay from Chile and you don't see the term Aconcagua Valley, you can also look for Casablanca Valley, Leyda Valley, which is Leyda, or San Antonio Valley. And these are all sub-regions within the Aconcagua Valley of Chile. So, in summary, if you're looking to try a Chardonnay, which I really hope you're looking to try a Chardonnay now that you've listened to this, here are a couple regions that you should look for one from. You can look for white Burgundy. You can look for Chablis, which is that region in northern Burgundy, very sharp, very much like Sauvignon Blanc. You can try a Blanc de Blanc Champagne if sparkling is more your thing. You can also try a Willamette Valley Chardonnay, a Yarra Valley Chardonnay, or a Chardonnay from the Aconcagua Valley in Chile, more specifically Casablanca, Leyda, or San Antonio Valley. All right, I hope this has convinced you that you need to give Chardonnay another chance. Please let me know how it goes. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. If you loved it as much as I did, I would so appreciate it if you could take a quick second to rate it and leave a review. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. We release new episodes every Wednesday. And of course, if you know a wine lover in your life that would love this episode, please share it with them. In next week's episode, I'll be interviewing the very inspirational Mary Womack. Mary is the winemaker at Damsel Cellars here in Washington, and I can't wait for you to hear her story. Thanks again for listening, and if you want to learn more about wine, come follow me at Cork and Fizz on Instagram. And to try more wines outside of your comfort zone, like these Chardonnays, be sure to sign up for my virtual tasting club, The Cork Crew. Use code WINE101 to get your first month absolutely free. Cheers!